Welcome, everyone. My name is Samira Mehta. I am the Director of Jewish Studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to our annual Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture. I'm going to start with some thanks, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, who we are so glad to have with us today. So first of all, welcome to those of you who are here with us in the Norland Library, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom from your homes. We're so glad to have all of you here, and there are many, many of you who are here in the virtual sense, and we're so glad. This is one of our annual public programs here at CU, and it's exciting to return to it as an in-person event. For the last several years, our Holocaust Remembrance Day events have been on Zoom. And so, it's nice to be able to bring both of those worlds together. And I would like to thank some of the folks involved in making this happen. Now, I have to warn you, there are even more thank yous at the end. So we're going to kind of split them up. But I'd first of all like to thank the university libraries, who are always such spectacular hosts. The David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts, the Louis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History, and the Departments of History and German and Slavic Languages. Now, unfortunately, our new Unfortunately, the Singer Chair was unable to be with us today, my colleague Thomas Peglow Kaplan, but he has sent remarks, and they are in his voice. So you are going to hear me claim to be in a relatively new role as the Louis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History. That's not me. That is my colleague, Professor Peglow Kaplan. So I would like you to imagine me much taller than I currently am, and I assume this is about as tall as I'm ever going to be. But allow me to share with you his words. Good evening and welcome. In my still relatively new role as the Louis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History and Professor of History at CU Boulder, I would also like to thank all of you for attending tonight's lecture, which is part of CU Boulder's programming to mark this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day. In a time of war in Europe, in which even survivors of the Shoah are being killed, and rising anti-Semitism and racism in the United States and around the globe, these commemorations have taken on a different meaning, and one might say, even greater urgency. I would, of course, like to express my special appreciation to our distinguished guests this evening. Professor Susanna Schroffstetter from the University of Vermont already led a great research colloquium on her work earlier today. Now it is my great pleasure to help introduce Professor Alan E. Steinweis, who will give tonight's International Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture. Professor Steinweis is the Raul Hilberg Distinguished Professor of Holocaust Studies and, since 2009, Professor of History at the University of Vermont in Burlington. Until 2020, for more than a decade, he also served as the director of the Center for Holocaust Studies at this fine university. Steinweis is an internationally renowned specialist in the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. He is the author of Art, Ideology, and Economics in Nazi Germany, The Reich Chambers of Music, Theater, and the Visual Arts, 1993, The Path-Breaking Studying the Jew, Scholarly Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, Harvard University Press, 2006, and Kristallnacht, 1938, Harvard University Press, 2009. His latest book, which I also highly recommend, is The People's Dictatorship, A History of Nazi Germany, Cambridge University Press, 2023. Steinweis has co-edited, if my count is correct, another 8 volumes, including Holocaust Memory in a Globalizing World, Wallenstein, 2017, and The Germans and the Holocaust, Popular Responses to the Persecution and Murder of the Jews, 2016. Steinweis is the series editor of the American edition of the Comprehensive History of the Holocaust, a monograph series sponsored by Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, and a member of the International Advisory Board for the Persecution and Murder of the Jews of Europe, an influential multi-volume document collection published by a consortium of German institutions. Moreover, he is an associate editor of, and I'm so sorry, Thomas is watching from home, I don't speak German. Alan, what is the title of your work? The associate, yes, of the journal. Thank you very much. The much-noted 1953 founded Journal of the Institute for Contemporary History, Munich, Berlin. In previous appointments, Professor Steinweis built Jewish and Holocaust studies as a professor of these fields at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, working, among others, closely with the University of Nebraska Press and helping to turn it into one of the leading presses in Holocaust studies. He was also honored with visiting professorships at numerous universities, especially in Germany, including the Universities of Augsburg and Hannover, the renowned Fritz Bauer Institute of the University of Frankfurt, and the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where he served as the chair for Jewish history and culture. Professor Steinweis has received numerous national and international fellowships and honors, which I will not list, Thomas's apologies, so that we can get started with his lecture on his new research project on the anti-Hitler resistance, which sheds new light on a much-researched, especially in the post-war German states, subject. Please help us welcome Professor Alan Steinweis.
Thanks very much. I'm very relieved that that large picture of me is now gone. That made me feel very uncomfortable. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the Jewish Studies program here at the University of Colorado for inviting me. Thanks to Samira for being such a gracious host. Thanks to Thomas Pegelow-Kaplan, who's watching at home. I should congratulate the University of Colorado for hiring him recently. That was a very good decision. You won't regret it. I also want to express my thanks to Maggie Rosenau for making the logistical arrangements for the visit. Universities have become large, complicated bureaucracies, and arranging for a couple of people to visit for a couple of days and give a couple of lectures involves a lot of work, and Maggie is really terrific at that. I want to conclude my opening remarks by conveying, albeit belatedly, my condolences to the university community for the passing of David Schneer. I knew David. We weren't close, but I knew him. I admired him very much. Several years ago, he held the Holocaust Memorial Lecture at the University of Vermont, and it was a really memorable event. I think I learned or tried to learn a few things from him about how to deliver a public lecture. In German society between 1933 and 1945, resistance to Nazism was the exception rather than the rule. When we talk about that resistance, it is important not to leave the impression that it was more common than it actually was. Nor should we suggest that it made much of a difference. The Nazi regime was not brought down from within, but defeated on the battlefield, at sea and in the air, by a militarily superior coalition of countries. The Nazi regime was a brutal one that imprisoned and killed Germans who opposed it. Resistance entailed risk, and it therefore required courage. It is important that we recognize and honor those Germans who mounted resistance to the Nazi regime, and that we understand their motivations for having done so, even if, in the final analysis, their acts of resistance had little impact on the course of history. My lecture this evening will address two of the most significant acts of resistance in Nazi Germany, both of them attempts to assassinate Hitler that came close to succeeding. I'm going to concentrate primarily on the motives of the would-be assassins, giving special attention to whether outrage at the persecution and murder of the Jews played a role. This is one question among many that historians have posed about the two failed assassination attempts. Other questions concern the planning and logistics of the assassination attempts, the reasons for their failure, and the place these events have assumed in the collective memory of resistance to Nazism. I will, I will focus less on these issues, but we can discuss them afterward during the Q&A. On the evening of November 8th, 1939, in a beer hall in Munich, Adolf Hitler narrowly escaped being blown to bits. He had traveled from Berlin to Munich, the birthplace of Nazism, to deliver a speech to party comrades on the occasion of the 16th anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, that being his attempt in 1923 to seize power in a coup d'etat. Every year on the evening of November 8th, Hitler delivered a speech at the site of the 1923 putsch, the Burger Bräukeller, a beer hall with a seating capacity of around 2,000. Hitler's speech on November 8th, 1939, was a tirade aimed at Great Britain. Having conquered Poland in cooperation with the Soviet Union in September, Germany now confronted Britain and France in the so-called phony war, during which combat was limited to periodic air raids and naval engagements. Hitler had secretly ordered a Western offensive to begin several days later, and his belligerent remarks about Britain were designed to incite German public opinion against that country. Of course, as we know, that offensive ended up being delayed into the spring of 1940. Hitler's speech on that evening was shorter than those he had given on November 8th in the past. On account of fog, Hitler had to travel back to Berlin by rail rather than by airplane. So he finished his speech ahead of schedule, departed the beer hall abruptly, and headed to Munich Central Station, where he boarded a special Führer train bound for Berlin. At 9:20 p.m., 13 minutes after Hitler had left the podium, a bomb exploded inside a structural column directly behind and above the speaker's platform, so roughly a few feet above where the swastika is in this photograph. And that's an actual photograph of him speaking on that evening. A substantial portion of the ceiling collapsed directly onto the spot where Hitler had stood just moments earlier. 7 people were killed immediately, and 1 died soon thereafter. An additional 60 people were injured. Hitler learned of the bombing when his train reached Nuremberg on its way to Berlin. The next day, the German press declared that the leader had been saved by divine providence. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion in Munich, theories about its origin proliferated. Germans projected their own prejudices and ideological sentiments onto the incident. Adolf Hitler's own immediate response was to suspect Otto Strasser, a former Nazi who had been engaging in anti-Hitler agitation from exile in Switzerland. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, who was traveling with Hitler on that evening, initially blamed a clique of Bavarian monarchists. The head of the Reich Criminal Police, Arthur Nebe, at first focused his suspicions onto members of the German Army High Command, as it was widely known in government circles that several of Hitler's generals had harbored serious reservations about the imminent military offensive against the Western powers. There was also a diversity of views among the German public. Many believed that the British were behind the attack. Others believed that the bombing had been a phony assassination attempt staged by the Nazi government itself in order to justify a new wave of crackdowns against dissent and opposition, and in order to inflame anti-British sentiment in the German population. Having long been saturated by propaganda depicting Jewish puppet masters plotting against their country, some Germans jumped to the conclusion that the attack on Hitler was Jewish revenge for the Kristallnacht. This seemed all the more likely because the bombing in Munich had taken place on the very eve of the one-year anniversary of that pogrom. The security service reported that many Germans suspected that either the British or the Jews were behind the attack in the beer hall. Anti-Jewish vandalism occurred in several places in Germany. In Nordheim, in Lower Franconia, northern Bavaria, school children smashed the windows of several Jewish homes after having been told by their teacher that the Jews had been behind the assassination attempt on the Führer. Some Jews were targeted for arrest in the 2 days following the incident. One of these was Dietrich Lisberger, a Jewish cook living in Munich, who was taken to the Stadelheim prison and interrogated about possible connections to the attack. Lisberger later testified that he was one among 120 men who had been arrested in Munich in the immediate aftermath of the beer hall bombing. About 150 Jewish men were arrested in the city of Breslau on the day after the assassination attempt. In Vienna, the city authorities ordered a curfew for 4 o'clock in the afternoon for the tens of thousands of Jews who still remained in the city, making it very difficult for them to shop for food and run other routine errands. The days after the bombing also saw a spike in the denunciation of Jews for sedition. Franz Cohen, a Jew in Munich, was prosecuted and sentenced to 5 months in prison after telling an acquaintance that the assassins had likely been members of the Nazi Party. The suspicion of Jewish complicity in the bombing produced lethal consequences for 21 Jewish inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. The second in command at Buchenwald, Arthur Raul, pictured here, had been in the beer hall when the bomb exploded. Raul was a longtime Nazi, having actually participated in the beer hall putsch in 1923. Later, in 1941, he would become the first commandant of the Gross Rosen concentration camp. After the explosion in the beer hall in November 1939, Raul quickly concluded that the Jews were responsible. The next day, 21 Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald were marched to the camp's notorious stone quarry and shot. And on the screen, you can see a card from the Buchenwald prisoner files illustrating how the killings were legally covered up. It says here at the bottom left that on November 9th, 1939, this particular prisoner was shot while trying to escape, which of course is, the classic cover story. Over the following 3 days, all of the Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald were locked in their barracks and deprived of food and water. On November 22nd, 2 weeks after the explosion, the German government announced the result of its investigation. The official story posited the existence of a conspiracy involving, first, British intelligence as the sponsor, second, Otto Strasse, who I mentioned earlier, as the organizer, and third, as the person who planted the bomb, a 36-year-old German cabinet maker and leftist by the name of Georg Elser. At the time this official story was propagated, the German investigators already knew that Georg Elser had acted alone. But attributing the bombing to a lone assassin would not have served the interests of official propaganda. So just briefly to explain the slide, so this was the big story in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, not the party newspaper, but notorious pro-Nazi newspaper. And Elser is pictured at the bottom left, and the two other men pictured on the front page are two British intelligence agents who, quite coincidentally, earlier in the month had been kidnapped at the German-Dutch border by German intelligence agents. That's kind of a pretty wild story unto itself. So one might ask, why didn't the German government blame the explosion on the Jews? Answering this question brings us back to the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. The massive and public anti-Jewish violence that had taken place during Kristallnacht had been received poorly by many Germans, in the general population, in the government, in the diplomatic corps, and in the officer corps of the German army, something that we'll be talking about later. These Germans did not necessarily oppose official anti-Semitism, but they preferred that the exclusion of Jews from German society proceed in a legal and orderly manner. Having sensed the disquiet produced in the country by Kristallnacht, during 1939, the Nazi leadership sought to avoid a repetition of the mass outburst of anti-Jewish violence. One might argue that the Kristallnacht had achieved its main purpose by accelerating Jewish emigration from Germany. More Jews emigrated from the German Reich in 1939 than in any year since the Nazi assumption of power. So in November 1939, blaming Jews for the Munich bomb would have been strategically counterproductive for the Nazi regime's Jewish policy. Focusing the anger of the German people against Britain made far more sense at that particular juncture of the war. So we ask, what motivated Georg Elser to try to kill Hitler? Crucial evidence of the truth about Elser's act long remained buried in a German archive. In 1964, a German historian researching a different subject stumbled upon the record of Elser's interrogation by the Gestapo in November 1939. And what you see here is the original cover sheet from the interrogation report. So the first big German word, Sprengstoffanschlag, so attack using explosives in the Bürgerbräu-Keller, that's the name of the beer hall, Munich on 8 November 1939, interrogation of the perpetrator. The interrogation report is a 203-page, double-spaced typescript. It is not a transcript of the interrogation, but rather a summary written by Gestapo agents of their questions and Elser's responses. The document constitutes the single most important source we have for proving Elser's lone responsibility for the bombing, for understanding how he constructed and planted the device, and for assessing, most importantly for us, for assessing his motivation. The report also contains a great deal of biographical information about the assassin. In light of this document, and supplemented by some other sources, we can now reflect for a few minutes on Georg Elser and his deed. Johann Georg Elser was born in 1903 in the town of Hermaringen in Swabia in south-central Germany, roughly between Munich and Stuttgart. He spent most of his life in the nearby town of Königsbronn. Small town. I've been there. It's pretty small. He trained as a cabinet maker, a demanding artisanal vocation. His political sympathies lay on the left, but he was not ideologically dogmatic. During the Depression, he voted for the Communist Party because of its support for workers. He never actually joined that party, although during the 1920s, he did become a nominal member of the Alliance of Red Front Fighters, a veterans organization connected to the communists. Like most people in his immediate region, he was a Protestant, but he sometimes prayed in a Catholic church. One piece of evidence among many others that he disapproved of dogmatic thinking. Elser's opposition to Nazism was generally known to his friends and relatives and workmates, but he did not share with them his intention to assassinate Hitler. The only direct evidence of his motive is what he told the Gestapo under interrogation in November 1939. He claimed to have reached his decision to kill Hitler in the autumn of 1938, after the crisis over Czechoslovakia, when it became clear that the regime was steering the country toward war. That was the crisis that culminated in the Munich agreement. Elser cited four main reasons for his act. This is what he told the Gestapo, his four main reasons. First, the general repressiveness of the Nazi regime. Second, the regime's exploitation of the German working class. Third, the likelihood that the regime would plunge Germany and Europe into a ruinous war. And fourth, the regime's attack on freedom of religion, especially the regime's promotion of the pro-Nazi German Christian movement. So in Nazi Germany, within German Protestantism, there was a kind of struggle, and the pro-Nazi Protestants there was a pro-Nazi Protestant group called the German Christians, and he was upset over the support that they were getting at the expense of kind of more mainstream Protestants like himself. Elser hoped that his bomb would kill not only Hitler, but also other top Nazis gathered in the beer hall. He did not expect that the removal of the leadership would result in the end of Nazi rule, which he considered to be entrenched in power. His hope, as he told his interrogators, was that Hitler would be succeeded by a new leader who was not committed to aggressive war and who would be more receptive to the needs of working-class Germans. Elser claimed not to know who that person might be. There is not a single mention of Jews in the 203-page interrogation report. We are therefore faced with the following question. Did Elser's motivation for trying to kill Hitler really not include abhorrence at the persecution of the Jews? Our contemporary understanding of Nazism rightly places a great emphasis on anti-Semitism, and some people may have difficulty accepting the proposition that this did not factor into Elser's thinking. For example, a German movie about Elser, released in 2015, includes an entirely manufactured statement made by Elser to his Gestapo interrogators, citing objections to the treatment of the Jews as a reason for his action. Perhaps the filmmaker, Oliver Hirschbiegel, invented the line fearing that his audience would be mystified and disappointed were no connection made between Elser's deed and the persecution of the Jews. But can a case be made for the plausibility of this particular exercise of cinematic license? Let's look at 3 pieces of evidence in assessing whether there's any plausibility to the notion that Elser did have this particular motivation. So this is a still from the film, which is a very good film. There's no evidence that he uttered the particular line he's saying here, but I still recommend the film. One possibility is that Elser did not mention Jews to the Gestapo interrogators because they simply never posed the question to him. I regard such a scenario as unlikely for the following reason. The interrogation report emphasized that Elser had made his decision to kill Hitler before November 1938. That's what the arrow is pointing at here. This is a copy of the original interrogation report. So November 1938, of course, was the month and year of the Kristallnacht pogrom. One of the 3 Gestapo agents tasked with interrogating Elser was Herbert Kappler, who had previously been based in Rome, working on the extradition of German Jews who had fled to Italy to escape prosecution for violating the Nazi prohibition on sex between Jews and Aryans. It is difficult to believe that someone like Kappler, who was in Italy chasing German Jews, would discuss November 1938 with Elser and not raise the subject of Kristallnacht, which was a momentous event in Germany's recent history. It is more likely, in my opinion, that the Kristallnacht was discussed, but then quickly dismissed as irrelevant to Elser's motives. The emphasis here is that he made the decision not in November 1938, but before November 1938. And before November 1938 would have been the crisis over Czechoslovakia and the Munich Agreement. A second piece of relevant evidence arose in an interview conducted in 1989, 50 years after the Munich bombing, with Eugen Raul, a friend of Elser's in Königsbrunn during the 1930s. In response to a question about Elser's opinion about the persecution of the Jews, Raul stated the following in 1989: "Georg was no enemy of the Jews. I can still remember a comment by him. He once said to me, 'Why do they torment the Jews? Why are they destroying them?'" It's entirely plausible that Raul's memory was accurate. It's also possible that Raul, 5 decades after the assassination attempt, adjusted his memory, consciously or not, so that it would correspond to the emerging consensus in German society of the late 1980s about the centrality of anti-Semitism to the Nazi regime. I think it's also worth mentioning that the Gestapo, after the assassination attempt, the Gestapo agents descended on Königsbrunn, the town where Elser was from and had been living before he went to Munich to plant the bomb. And they interrogated everybody whom Elser knew and all of his relatives and so forth. And there's no record of any of them telling the Gestapo that this had anything to do with the Jews. And then also, historians and journalists for many decades after 1945 would interview people who knew Elser or his relatives to try to find out more about the case. And nothing came out about Elser's concern about the Jews. This statement by Eugen Raul is the single piece of evidence that we have, or the single assertion that Elser had made such a statement. A third relevant fact was the presence of persecuted Jews in Elser's own proximity before November 1939. There were no Jews in Königsbrunn, where Elser lived, but there were several Jewish families in the nearby town of Heidenheim, where Elser worked between December 1936 and August 1939. During the November pogrom, the Kristallnacht, the homes of two of these families, the Metzgers and the Vollweilers, were attacked and demolished. What you see in the slide here are three so-called Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones. Some of you will be familiar with this. In Germany and other countries in Europe, these little plaques have been in widespread use for some time to memorialize Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. You're not looking at a wall, you're looking at the ground, right? And so the Stolperstein are these kind of like bronze plates embedded into the ground in front of the houses where the Jews lived at the time of their deportation. And the idea is, you know, as an example of memory work, the idea is that if you're going about your everyday life, you know, you might not notice a plaque on a wall somewhere, but you'll notice the stone, you'll stumble over it, and therefore wonder what it is and look at it. So these are three Stolpersteine set up in Heidenheim for members of the Metzger family, and you can see here that they were deported in 1941 to Riga, where presumably they were killed by German commandos, the Einsatzgruppe. 2 days after the pogrom, after the Kristallnacht, in November 1938, one of the local newspapers justified the anti-Jewish violence in Heidenheim. So I'm quoting now I assume that most of you don't read German Gothic script. So I'm now translating the bold-faced words. Some people's comrades were overcome by righteous indignation against the Jewish scum. That's the explanation for the Kristallnacht. Overcome by righteous indignation against the Jewish scum, which had much to answer for in Germany, and is to blame for all of the misery and material hardship in the years before the war. That's a reference to the First World War. We do not know whether Georg Elser learned about the anti-Jewish violence in Heidenheim, but he certainly knew about the Kristallnacht pogrom, which was widely discussed among much of the German population. If it is in fact the case that Elser reached his decision to kill Hitler before November 1938, as I argued earlier, and as he told the Gestapo, then it is easy to imagine that the Kristallnacht further deepened his feelings of repugnance given what we know about Elser as a person and an anti-Nazi. But we really don't know. Starting at the time that it happened, and then for many decades afterward, the bombing in the Munich Beer Hall was interpreted in the service of one political narrative or another. The British did it, Otto Strasser did it, the Gestapo did it, the Wehrmacht did it, Bavarian monarchists did it, the Jews did it. Eventually, historical research restored to Georg Elser his personal agency for an audacious, ingenious, and nearly successful act of resistance. Tempting as it might be to squeeze the attempted assassination of Hitler into a psychologically gratifying and politically useful narrative about German opposition to the persecution of the Jews, the evidence supporting such a view is extremely limited. As we think about how best to appreciate Elser's actions, we should endeavor to understand him on his own terms. The reasons he gave to the Gestapo for why he found the regime repellent suffice as an explanation for his motive and remind us of the destructiveness of Nazism beyond the persecution of the Jews. On the day after Elser's attempt to kill Hitler, a German officer wrote the following: "What can one say about the rotten crime that took place in Munich? Hopefully they will catch the guys and mete out the hardest punishment conceivable by the human imagination. The consequences of this assassination would have been unimaginable, but destiny extends its protective hand over great men until they have fulfilled their mission." These words were written by Albrecht Ritter Merz von Quernheim, a 34-year-old army captain. Less than 5 years later, in July 1944, Merz, by then a colonel, participated in a plot to assassinate Hitler. This dramatic change of heart was brought about by two main factors. The first of these was the increasingly criminal nature of Germany's war efforts, starting with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The second factor was the growing likelihood, after the German debacle at the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942, early 1943, that Germany would actually lose the war. Merz was not alone among German military officers whose initial enthusiasm for Nazism turned into disillusion and who eventually decided that Hitler had to go. Their plotting culminated in the July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler and remove the Nazis from power by means of a military coup. The chief figure in the plot was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg. He had been born in 1907 into an aristocratic family in Swabia. In fact, he grew up around 35 miles from where Georg Elser had grown up and was only 3 years younger. Intellectual and artistic that's a coincidence. Intellectual and artistic pursuits were taken seriously in his family, as was the practice of Catholicism. In 1944, Stauffenberg served as the chief of staff of the Replacement Army, which was responsible for training soldiers and units inside Germany prior to their reassignment outside the country. The Replacement Army was the largest element of the German armed forces stationed inside Germany itself. Part of its mission was to quell domestic unrest, which the German leadership feared because of the millions of foreign workers present on German soil. Among the replacement army's contingency plans was Operation Valkyrie, which was designed to put down an insurrection or protect the homeland in the event of an invasion by foreign paratroopers. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators intended to assassinate Hitler, blamed the assassination on the SS, and implement Valkyrie to seize the levers of power inside the country. The action would also involve arresting other leading members of the Nazi elite. While only the leaders of the plot, like Stauffenberg himself and several dozen others, were clued in about the true intention for invoking Operation Valkyrie, the vast majority of the soldiers required for the plot to work would simply follow orders as they had been trained to do. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb planted by Stauffenberg at a briefing at Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia exploded, leaving the Führer injured. The Valkyrie plot fell apart when top generals, upon learning that Hitler was still alive, refused to go along. Stauffenberg and several of his co-conspirators were summarily executed. The Gestapo eventually identified a total of 132 participants in the plot, drawn from many different sectors of German society, not only the military. The roughly 100 people who were executed for their participation encompassed military officers, civil servants, diplomats, businessmen, clergymen, and figures from the labor movement. The conspirators were an ideologically diverse group, ranging from social democrats to longtime members of the Nazi Party. Several had been directly involved in the formulation and implementation of anti-Semitic policies. One of these, who had been involved in anti-Semitic policies, was Arthur Nebe, pictured here at left, who, as I noted earlier, in 1939, had supervised the official investigation into the Munich Beer Hall bombing. Later, Nebe commanded a German mobile killing unit, an Einsatzgruppe, that was responsible for the murder of tens of thousands of Jews in the Soviet Union. The most prominent figure on the civilian side of the conspiracy, pictured here at right, was the former mayor of Leipzig, Karl Gordeler, a conservative nationalist who had repeatedly objected to the Nazi regime's anti-Semitic actions. When you look at these two examples, obviously, it's impossible to generalize when speaking about how over 100 conspirators viewed Germany's treatment of the Jews. So while I'm going to concentrate a little more on Stauffenberg, we should not treat his case as representative of all the July 20th conspirators. Like many other young army officers, Claus von Stauffenberg initially welcomed the advent of the Nazi regime in 1933. Hitler promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to its proper place, as they saw it, among the military powers of Europe. Hitler followed through on this promise by pursuing an ambitious program of rearmament and by reinitiating the draft. Stauffenberg, like many of his peers in the officer corps, hailed from an aristocratic, conservative, and nationalist circle in which anti-Semitism was widespread. While these aristocrats often rejected the racist and populist anti-Semitism that animated the Nazi movement, they did subscribe to stereotypes about Jewish materialism or Jewish support for communism. They shared the very commonly held opinion in German society that Jews exercised too much influence in commercial life, the medical profession, cultural life, and the press. Historians have compiled overwhelming evidence in favor of a consensus in German society favoring a reduction of Jewish participation in those fields, provided that this was accomplished through legal and nonviolent means. After the war, people who had known Stauffenberg reported that he had shared that particular kind of anti-Semitism. Stauffenberg's contemporaries also reported after 1945 that he had been outraged by the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, believing that the orgy of violence and the mass destruction of houses of worship had been an assault against law, morality, and German dignity. Negative reactions to Kristallnacht were common among Germans who had previously supported nonviolent measures targeted at Jews. There is abundant evidence that for several of the July 20th, 1944 conspirators, Kristallnacht prompted the beginning of a reassessment of the Nazi regime. The real turning point for Stauffenberg came after June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Stauffenberg was then a general staff officer in the high command of the army and was privy to the massive crimes being perpetrated in Eastern Europe against Jews and other civilians, as well as against Soviet prisoners of war. So offended was Stauffenberg by these crimes that he requested a transfer to service at the front in a different theater of operation. He received his wish and was relocated to North Africa in 1943. By the time he arrived there, in Tunisia, he was a determined opponent of the Nazi regime who believed that Hitler needed to be removed from power. In the 2008 film Valkyrie, Stauffenberg, played by Tom Cruise, we can talk about that, is depicted as expressing disgust at German crimes, including the mass murder of the Jews. This is more or less historically accurate. In the film, he's shown making a diary entry, and we don't have a Stauffenberg diary, but pretty much what he is quoted as saying in this scene in the film has been attributed to him credibly. So this is more or less historically accurate. Problematic, however, is that this is how the film begins. And the viewer is not told that Stauffenberg had been pro-Nazi before he became anti-Nazi, had supported nonviolent measures aimed at purging Jews from the mainstream of German society, and had supported the German military campaigns against Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. The movie omits yet another important fact. Even after Stauffenberg turned against the Nazi regime, so strong was his anti-communism that he opposed moving against Hitler before Germany could secure a victory against the Soviet Union. His eventual realization that Germany could not win the war helped drive him to join the anti-Hitler conspiracy, to which he was a relative latecomer. None of this detracts from Stauffenberg's courage and self-sacrifice on July 20th, 1944, for which he paid with his life. When we contemplate the horror and depravity of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, it is natural that we look for heroes. We look for stories that reassure us of the capacity of people to retain their moral integrity and courage in the face of evil. We do not need to invent those stories because authentic ones do exist. But as these two examples show, we are sometimes tempted to embellish the stories or to omit inconvenient details, to bring the narrative into line with our own current-day understanding of what constitutes righteous behavior. When we do this, we do a disservice to real historical understanding. Admirable figures from history acted for reasons that were compelling to them and not for the purpose of validating our own preferred historical narratives or providing us with redemptive storylines. The story of Georg Elser reminds us that the evils of Nazi Germany extended well beyond its treatment of the Jews. And the story of Claus von Stauffenberg reminds us that even some anti-Semites recognized lines they refused to cross. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. As I work my way up to the front of the room, just a couple of notes about what we are going to do now for the question and answer period. So there are about double the number of people online that there are here in the room, which is just phenomenal because there are a lot of you here in this room. So what we're going to do is my colleague, Henry Lovejoy, is on the computer in the back. And so I'm going to take a question from the room, and then Henry is going to take a question from the Zoom room, and we're just going to alternate back and forth for you like that. And so if anyone in the room has a question, please raise your hand and I will come by with a microphone.
Why did you refer to the Nazis as the people's dictatorship?
Well, the question is not a reference to the lecture, but a reference to the title of my newly published book. I'm not sure you want to spend time right now discussing that. I'm happy to speak to you about it afterward. The fast answer is that the Nazis had a slogan, and the slogan was the people's community. They were building a people's community. And so my title is an attempt to invert that.
So at the moment, we don't have a question in the Zoom room, so I believe your hand was the next one to go up.
How do other anti-Nazi Germans, such as Wilhelm Canaris, fit into this picture?
Well, he was part of that same clique of, like, you know, in the important, one of the important loci for this high-level anti-Hitler conspiring was German military intelligence, and that's what Wilhelm Canaris was involved with. And several of the other people who were executed, including Canaris, who were executed after July 20th, 1944, came from that particular sector.
Anything on Zoom? We've got something coming from the Zoom room, I think.
Yes, so do you think the Germans would have eventually been able to...
I'm sorry, can you start again?
Yeah, absolutely, sorry about that. Do you think the Germans would have eventually been able to overthrow Hitler themselves? Or was the German dictatorship too powerful to overthrow from within?
On the first day of historical methods class, when you're a graduate student, you're instructed not to talk about what didn't happen. So, we don't know. But I did observe at the beginning of the talk that, well, you're instructed not to talk about what didn't happen, you're instructed not to predict the future based on what did happen. But that having been said, I did mention at the beginning that, as a matter of historical fact, Nazi Germany was defeated from without and not toppled from within.
I'm going to just check and see if any of the students in the room have a question. Sir, the microphone is on. Do any of the students have a question? If not, we will turn to some of the guests.
Would you consider those who were righteous and helped Jews, like Oskar Schindler, as somebody who was also resistant to Hitler?
Yes, I talked about two instances of resistance among many, with the caveat that, we need to recognize the people who mounted resistance in one way or the other. Keep in mind that they were a minority, but we need to recognize those who actually did resist, and obviously there were more than these two. Historians of resistance in Nazi Germany actually have created a category for resistance that took the form of helping Jews, hiding Jews, helping Jews escape, and so forth. It's called rescue resistance. That's the German Rettungswiderstand, in English, rescue resistance. And those are the people, the people who are recognized as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem fall into that category. Of all of the 100 and so odd people who have been identified as being involved in the July 20th, 1944 conspiracy, one is recognized in Yad Vashem, Hans von Dachnani, who was also a member of that intelligence operation, and he personally helped some Jews escape. But he was already arrested and imprisoned before July. He was executed as well, but he couldn't participate in the July 20th, 44 plot because he had already been put in prison for something else.
Anything from the back? Yes.
Sure, we have another question from the chat. How would you locate the White Rose group in Munich to the context of your talk?
Well, one form of resistance, the question is about the White Rose. So the White Rose were a group of University of Munich students, young people in their early 20s, and they were anti-Nazi, and they published, a kind of like Samizdat publication, like underground. They kind of like ran off with mimeograph machines, flyers, 5 in all, that they distributed. One of the flyers actually partially is dedicated to denouncing the killing of the Jews in Eastern Europe by the Germans. So, I think when you talk about resistance being at least partially motivated by outrage at the persecution and murder of the Jews, the White Rose is part of that story. They were caught. They were in the process of distributing a flyer. They were caught. They were put on trial, and they were executed. It occurred to me as I answered that. I don't think I mentioned in the lecture what actually happened to Elser, did I? Yeah. So they kept him in prison, hoping over the long term to use him in a show trial where they were going to basically kind of try to frame the British government for trying to kill Hitler. But things kind of moved beyond the point where that would have been possible, And at some point, we don't know, probably in, the date that's officially given is April 9th, 1945, he was murdered in the Dachau concentration camp. But he did not survive the war.
Thank you. A conspiracy by more than 100 people is kind of hard to imagine that the secret wouldn't come out. How can you say a little bit more about how it was organized? Were the people mostly motivated by what they thought was the impending loss in the war? And also, when it became public, how did the German public at that point respond to that?
Yeah. Well, their motivations were all over the place, you know, like some of these people were Democrats, like what we would call, you know, liberal Democrats. There were social Democrats, you know, people on the political left. One very prominent social Democrat was arrested and executed. A lot of these military officers, you know, they did not, all of these people, you know, representing such a broad ideological spectrum, did not possess a unified vision of what Germany would look like after the Nazis would be successfully removed from power. You know, in terms of keeping a secret, the number of people who were kind of like sworn into there was like an inner circle of people who actually knew about Valkyrie, about the actual method that would be used. You know, I would say there you're probably talking about, you know, a couple of dozen. That's just a number I'm, you know, something in that perspective. You know, some of the people who were involved in the conspiracy had been fairly open opponents of Hitler all along, most notably Karl Gordeler. And he was being followed by the Gestapo. He had been the mayor of Leipzig when the Nazis were trying to, you know, persecute Jews in Leipzig. He would try to make them stop. He lost his job over in an incident that's fairly celebrated. Leipzig, for those of you who appreciate classical music, Leipzig is the home of the Gewandhaus Orchestra. The Gewandhaus is the orchestra hall, and in front of the Gewandhaus there was a statue of the German composer Felix Mendelssohn, who, according to Nazi racial laws, was Jewish. Mendelssohn was not a practicing Jew. The family had converted, but he was Jewish by Nazi racial laws. And the local Nazis announced their intention to take down the statue. And he opposed it. He was the mayor, so he had some clout, and he opposed it. And he was out of town on a trip, and they took it down when he was out of town. And then he complained about it, and then, you know, he was removed. So he was, you know, since those kinds of clashes, he was being followed by the Gestapo. Another very important member of the 20th of July conspiracy, who I didn't talk about, was Ludwig Beck. And he was the head of the German General Staff, had been the head of the German General Staff, I mean, the very high-ranking military officer in 1938. And, you know, he wasn't a pacifist or anything, but he thought that Hitler was playing a bit fast and loose, you know, with Czechoslovakia, and basically resigned in protest because he thought that Hitler, you know, he understood the same thing that Elser did. So what Ludwig Beck did was he quit, and what Elser did is he tried to kill Hitler, right? But the notion that this guy is going to get us into a war that's going to do a lot of damage, including to us. And, you know, a high-level military officer who clashes with Hitler and, you know, quits in, resigns in protest. He's also being followed. So a lot of these people are being followed. The Gestapo knows that the stuff going on, you know, July 20th, 1944 is a few weeks after the Normandy invasion. You know, the war had, you know, the Soviets had been pushing the Germans back on the Eastern Front from some time. The Americans were coming up the Italian peninsula. They had invaded from North Africa, were coming up. And now, the D-Day invasion is successful, and the Germany is being closed on in 3 directions. And the Gestapo knows that, there are a lot of people in the country who think that this might be a time to take out the leader, right? So they increase their vigilance at this moment, and people were being followed. So, it's kind of like a case where there were people in the Gestapo who knew that maybe something was up, but they didn't know the details. Kind of like September 11th, right? People know, the intelligence people have a hint that something's in the works, but they don't really have a clear picture of what it is and who it is. And either Ludwig Beck or Karl Gordeler, or maybe both, right before July 20th, they had to go into hiding.
And the response of the public?
The response of the public, well, depended whether you were pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi. A lot of people were outraged, obviously. The assassination attempt and the planned coup was supposed to remove Hitler, but it actually made the regime even kind of more totalitarian, because now, after what had happened, Hitler had even greater paranoia toward anybody who was not kind of part of the inner circle of the Nazi movement, right? And so he relied less on the military, and, Himmler became more powerful and so forth. So the regime kind of became more oppressive. And, the number of Germans killed in World War II between the middle of 1944 and the end of the war was greater than the number of Germans killed in the war up to that point, right? So everything, the violence is escalating, and the polarization within the society is also escalating. And so, for Hitler's, for Germans who revered Hitler, and there were many of them, this was another instance, as had happened in November 1939 with the Beer Hall bombing. Hitler was again, saved by divine intervention, right? This was yet further evidence that the Fuhrer was the right person at the right time, and he deserves our support and so forth. And obviously, there were other people who would have been, many people who would have been very happy to see Hitler go.
Are there questions in the chat?
Yes, this one comes from Thomas, who says, "An excellent talk, Alan. Thank you so much. Most historians in and beyond Germany seem to agree with Peter Steinbach's dictum that the final solution was not a motivation of note for the German anti-Hitler resistance. So in this sense, your argument and findings are not so surprising. Would you agree with Steinbach, or do you see counterexamples when looking at other groups of note, beyond German Jewish individuals or groups who resisted, however defined, in response to their persecution?"
What's the exact phrase attributed to Steinbach toward the beginning of that question?
The final solution?
Right, but more broadly, that what did Steinbach argue? I want to know what I'm agreeing or not agreeing with.
Was not a motivation of note for the German?
Of note, right, yeah. I think it was a motivation for some. We talked earlier, it was a motivation for the White Rose. It was a motivation, when after the 20th of July, when the Gestapo arrested all of these people, they interrogated them. And they wrote up, we don't have the interrogation records like we do for Elser, but the Gestapo wrote up reports and was sending them to the Chancellery, to Hitler. I don't know whether he read them personally, but these records were discovered in the records of the Chancellery. So kind of summaries of what these people were saying in the interrogations, and a fairly significant number, and these have been published, these reports, and a fairly significant number of the July 20th conspirators talked about the final solution. They may not have used that word, but talked about the atrocities against Jews, among other atrocities, as, you know, a disgrace for the German people, something that was immoral, and something that needed to be resisted. You know, it could very well be that some of this ethical reflection that they made in Gestapo custody, you know, while being tortured, was retrospective. You know, perhaps, you know, they were embellishing how they had felt about it previously. Although if you're trying to avoid harsh treatment from the Gestapo in late July 1944 or early August 1944, the way to do that is not to say that you wanted to see Hitler killed in part because of the way that the Jews were being treated, right? So, you know, we have reason to think that these were authentic statements. So, you know, so I think that's an example. And then if you want to expand the concept of resistance even further to include the Rettungswiderstand that we talked about earlier, the saving of Jews, what my wife and colleague Susanne Schrafstetter talked about earlier on campus today, you know, like the Germans who hid Jews in many different kind of situations, Jews who had gone underground while trying to escape deportation. You know, I wouldn't say, you know, the key phrase in the question is of note. You know, I think there were Germans engaged in resistance activity who were motivated by this. Whether the number rises to the level that you would say of note is, you know, perhaps a question about language, but I wouldn't so readily agree with my colleague, Thomas.
From the room, we've got a couple of student questions.
So over 100 people, you said, decided that that killing Hitler would be the best way to throw a wrench in the works. Could you explain why they decided that that was the ideal path to take rather than a different act of resistance?
Well, you mean specifically killing Hitler as opposed to, say, arresting him?
That or there were some members of the military in that, if were there other methods that they could have done, and why they chose killing Hitler as their goal?
Right. This is a regime that had launched the most extensive war of conquest and annihilation in human history. There had been mass death taking place on a continental-wide scale for years. And this was being perpetrated by a regime, by a society in which there were millions of acolytes of this dictator who hung on his every word, who believed that he had been given to the country by God. And in July 1944, these people, like Georg Elser, also in November 1939, understood that ending the regime required removing Hitler in a way that he couldn't come back. This one person was indispensable to Nazism. So if you're going to dismantle a system like that, you have to start there. You have to start at the top. I think that's their, because if you took him prisoner, then he's still alive, and then people try to rescue, and that kind. What do you do with them, right? So, you know, there have been people who, you know, even at the time, some of the conspirators wondered about the ethics of political assassination. Tyrannicide is the term that is very often used, the killing of a tyrant. It's an old topic, you know, St. Augustine wrote a classic text about it. You know, probably the most famous tyrannicide in history is Julius Caesar. You know, there is a strong case that if the person is bad enough and the amount of suffering that can be ended is sufficient, that it's morally justified to kill a person who you could arrest and imprison rather than kill.
A final question from the chat, and then I'll take a final question from the room.
Yes, a woman from the chat asks, says about 4 or 5 years ago, she went on an interactive exhibit in Germany on von Stauffenberg. One question asked was he a hero? The answers were definitely mixed that day, and they went on a day when a German school class was there, and it was interesting to hear their reaction to the exhibit. What is your sense of how Germans view him?
Oh, he's definitely seen as a hero. That's why he's on a postage stamp. Actually, he was elevated to kind of hero status long before Georg Elser was. This is, you know, one could do an entire evening event just on this question, like, you know, why already in the 1960s, you know, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was a widespread tendency in German society to see these people as traitors. This gets back to the earlier question about, you know, public opinion. You know, the country's at war. How can you try to kill the leader? Yeah, okay, well, you know, we did some nasty things under Hitler, but, you know, but so did the Allies who bombed our cities, and so did Stalin, and so forth. So, you know, nobody's an angel here. That's the kind of thinking there was. But over time, Stauffenberg was kind of, you know, established as a hero. I believe this postage stamp dates from about 1973 or 1974. Elser remained a more controversial figure toward the end of, much later, almost to the end of the 20th century. And it's only really, I think this stamp, you can see there's I think the date of the stamp is after the year 2000. So, 2003. Where is that? Yes, thank you. Okay, there you go. Okay, right. So, yeah, it's bigger here than it is on my screen. So it took a long time, and the reasons for that are complex, and I think we'd need a lot more time to go into that. But you know, to that basic question, was I asked if I think that Stauffenberg is a hero, or is Stauffenberg considered a hero in Germany?
No, what is your sense of how Germans view him?
Oh, how Germans, right. I think he's considered a hero. I think recently, as I kind of indicated in my lecture, many people who have considered him a hero have come to concede that he was a complicated hero, that he did the wrong thing before he did the right thing. But that's not uncommon historically. You know, I think we have similar conversations in the United States about people who are widely considered heroes, like Abraham Lincoln comes to mind. You know, save the Union, you know, freed the slaves, and so forth. And, you know, recently it's been pointed out, you know, that he harbored racist sentiments. He said racist things, right? He said things that would lead people to characterize him reasonably as a white supremacist. Does that mean that he's not a hero, or does that mean that we have to understand our heroes as complex figures living in different times than our own, who, we have to assess their actions and their thoughts against the standards of their day and not the standards of ours. And I think in Stauffenberg's case, that's happened as well. The fact that, that important historians, including his own biographer, Peter Hoffmann, of McGill University, who's the great historian of the 20th of July, in his biography of Stauffenberg, he also very clearly points out how this person went through an evolution, and he did the right thing at the end. But along the way, he held some rather reprehensible views.
So a final question from the room, and I'm going to give the opportunity to a student.
So my question started to get answered there at the end of that last one. I was curious if you think there's a particular value to thinking about the individuals who might be seen as sort of heroes of an anti-Nazi resistance as being much more sort of complicated figures than it would be helpful to paint them as, right? That Stauffenberg had anti-Semitic views before he chose to participate in the killing of Hitler, that Nebe commanded an Einsatzgruppen unit that was responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of Jews. How do you sort of think about the importance of those figures who really may have done very wrong things before they chose to do right things, and their importance in this conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nebe is kind of an extreme case, because he was a mass murderer. I mean, he was a bona fide mass murderer. He didn't survive the war. I forgot how he was killed, but he didn't survive the war. Well, he was executed for the 20th of July, but I think it took them a while to figure it out, to figure out his role and catch him. It would have been interesting had somebody like that survived to ask him, about that kind of thing. It's clear that some of these people who were in the 20th of July were opportunists. I mentioned that there were two main reasons why people joined that conspiracy, and one was that they were opposed kind of morally to one or another thing the regime was doing, and the other is that they thought that the regime was going to lose the war. And a lot of these people feared the consequences of losing the war, and they figured, if we're going to, what we need to do is get rid of Hitler, and then the Allies will be more likely to kind of like negotiate with us. Maybe we'll be able to negotiate with the Western powers once Hitler is out, and they'll join us in a crusade against the Soviet Union or something like that. This whole idea of a separate peace. In cases like Nebe, another one was this guy Heldorf. He had been the police chief in Berlin, the president of the Berlin police, and in that capacity, he also had done some terrible things, involved in the roundup and deportation of Jews and mistreatment of a lot of people and that kind of thing. And in these cases, they're probably opportunists. They're just afraid of the consequences of losing the war, and they want to see a change, because they know if the war is lost, that they're going to be in big trouble. I guess your question is basically how one thinks about a case not merely where somebody does the wrong thing before doing the right thing, but the wrong thing that somebody did is really, really bad. And how do we categorize those people? Are those people eligible for hero status or that kind of thing.
I'm not sure that I specifically mean hero status,
Right.
but rather sort of how we, in general, want to be thinking of them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my lecture was an attempt to do that with Stauffenberg. You know, people have, sometimes people have long lives and long careers, and they evolve. They learn, they change their minds, and you know, we have to, you know, sometimes people start out okay. And, you know, in one of my other, in one of my books, I talk about, my book about Nazi anti-Semitic scholars. I talk about, write about a man named Gerhard Kittel, who was the leading New Testament scholar of his generation in Germany, a professor at the University of Tübingen. Ich würde gerne selber diskutieren. Danke. A professor at the University of Tübingen, and kind of a philo-Semite, had worked closely, because, you know, the study of the New Testament involves, you know, kind of like late Judaism, late Second Temple Judaism. And so he, you know, he had good relationship, had Jewish students and so forth. And he evolves during the Nazi period into one of the leading academic anti-Semites. He wrote things about how the Jews, how the Talmud gave permission to Jews to murder Christians for their own benefit and that kind of thing. And he was publishing and saying things like this, you know, while the Jews of Germany were being deported, you know, to their deaths and so forth. And so, you know, that's an example of kind of somebody who did the right thing before he did the wrong thing. And we have to look at, in kind of distinction to Stauffenberg, and we have to just, you know, not look at snapshots of people's lives, but look at the entirety of their lives and assess them that way. I guess if somebody makes a contribution early in life and then screws up at the end, then the question we have to ask is, do we cancel the good stuff because of what they did later? And the opposite of that is, if somebody does something good at the end, do we overlook the earlier bad stuff? And as a historian, I would say we have to look at the whole story.
So on that note of the contrast between redemption and cancellation, I want to thank all of you. I want to start by thanking you, Alan, for joining us this evening, Susanna for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank, once again, the university libraries for hosting us here in the British and Irish Studies space, and for their partnership over the years and into the future. I want to thank the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts, established in the memory of our dear friend and colleague, David Schneer of blessed memory. The people involved in making tonight possible. Dan and your team of tech wizards, thank you so much for everything that you do in the moment here in the space, and everything that you do beforehand. Henry, thank you for manning the chat. I would like to thank Danya Rivlin and Eyal Rivlin, who are not here, but whose beautiful music you heard in the room before the program and on the Zoom. The song is Shalom from their album, Coming Home. Maggie Rosenau and Angela Watts from the program in Jewish Studies, who did an immense amount of work to make tonight possible. And once again, I would like to thank you, Alan, and you, Susanna, for what you have brought to share with us today. I also want to mention some upcoming events. You may be familiar with our Schmoozapalooza program, which is a musical evening put on by our Hebrew program. That will be on March 15th. And the Bender Lecture with Julia Watts-Belser will occur by Zoom on March 22nd. And once again, I really want to thank all of you for coming out and for all of you on Zoom for welcoming us into your homes. We really appreciate the chance to learn together in this community. Thank you.